gold trails and ghost towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barley.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts, Bill Barley, our storyteller, and we're going to sort of pick up on a story we told a year or so ago. We were talking about coal on Vancouver Island and the millions that made for the coal baron, the king of coal on Vancouver Island, Robert Dunsmuir. He made, he probably was one of the richest men in North America.
Yeah, he started with 83 cents a day as a miner, underground miner, and eventually ended up with a sum of $15 million in his estate, which was staggering in those days. Yeah. But, you know, I call this story, From Rags to Riches to Rags in 3 Generations, which is an old saying, and happens to prove true in the case of the Dunsmuir family. And when you look at Dunsmuir, what you see is a progression. His first years, you know, his first year, there's his house in Wellington, shows, you know, fairly good, manager's house, new owner and so on. Then you go to his first house in Victoria. Really quite a step up. This is Fairview in Victoria.
A little bit grander.
Yes, indeed. And finally you go to his last house in Victoria, and this is Craigdarroch Castle, which he had promised his wife Joan that he would leave her in a castle, and indeed he did. He never saw the completion of the house. But when you really examine Robert Dunsmuir, you see an individual with a lot of sharp practices. And you can tell that, Mike, by the way he treated his friends and acquaintances. And he knew a lot of people. A lot of people liked him in his early youth. But when you take a look at how he treated the Smallbones family, and he knew the Smallbones family, they were up near Diver Lake, and they had a 100-acre lot in there, which was, you know, quite a large piece of ground. He drilled that, unknown to them. Discovered there were some massive coal seams. Figured he could make $1 million net profit. He would make millions and millions of dollars while he could make $1 million. He bought that from Smallbones for $75, according to his daughter telling. That's the first thing. Secondly, underweighing of coal in his Wellington colliery. He had the miners worked it for a dollar a ton at that time, which is cheap enough.
Yeah.
And they weighed it out, and they're supposed to weigh it on a scales that would go anywhere from 900 to 12 or 1,300 pounds, which is all they could put in a coal car. And they would fill that coal car up and always weighed a maximum of 900 pounds. And they said it isn't working right. And they fought about it for month after month after month. And finally, Dunsmuir came along, put himself in the coal car, and he weighed 150 pounds. And he said, there, it weighs 150 pounds, it's right. Miners still didn't trust it, found out that the plates were connecting at 900 pounds. So if you put 1,200 pounds in, the extra 300 pounds went to Dunsmuir.
So he was making 20% off each one of his deals for years and years and years.
That's right, up to, yep.
Okay, there's a story of him needing access to Departure Bay. That's another ripple.
William Hughes was an old friend of his, knew him for many, many years. And Hughes knew that he had some land there, and Hughes had a business. Hughes was in a business, he had a fishing business. He needed access too, but he was willing to give Dunsmuir access for $300 a year. Dunsmuir was a rich man by this time, and becoming very much more wealthy. He wouldn't accept that $300 for a lease per year. And he went through the long, tortuous route to the courts and got it virtually for nothing. And finally, his first partner, Diggle. It was Dunsmuir, Diggle and Company. Diggle owned half the company. Diggle was a titled aristocrat from England who married late in life, about 32 years old, and married a woman he was extremely fond of, very much in love with. She died an unnatural death, really an unnatural death. And he was distraught about it. And that was the time Dunsmuir stepped in, took advantage of Diggle, gave him $600,000, which was a lot of money then. But this company was at that time, 1883, worth about $10 million. He should have given him probably $3 or $4 million at least, gave him $600,000, and Diggle at that time had been getting half the profits. So Robert Dunsmuir was very sharp indeed.
And you can see his dealings obviously helped him a lot as he rose to one of the richest men in North America, $15 million in his estate by the time he died. But something in my heart says, isn't it fortunate that somehow, as a result of all those connivings and dealings, his family didn't really benefit from it all? That's what today's story is about.
You bet it is.
Okay, from rags to riches to rags. Today, as we look at the Dunsmuir Saga, pretty good book on the subject, the Dunsmuir Saga, written by Terry Reksten. You think this is not a bad book, not a bad history on the subject?
I think Terry Reksten did a superb job on it. It's extremely well researched. He's a professional writer. It's a book that I put up and couldn't put down until I finished it.
All right. Talk about the Dunsmuir family today on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. towns. We're talking about the Dunsmuir family and how all that money really didn't stick to the family for very long. Robert and Joan, Robert Dunsmuir and his wife Joan, had a pretty big family, 11 kids?
Yeah, 11 kids, 3 boys. One died in his infancy, and 8 girls.
Okay.
And 2 of the boys who survived, almost opposites. Certainly James, who was the elder of the 2, was stolid, unimaginative, kind to his family, not too kind to his workers, generally autocratic. Became Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, an undistinguished Lieutenant Governor, which is unusual, and really was an unimaginative manager. He inherited a massive fortune.
Did he get half his dad's fortune? I mean, did he get about $7 million to play with?
Well, he got most of the coal holdings. Actually, his father left the whole estate of about $15 million to his wife, Joan. But the actual running of the mines and so on, and there was considerable dispute over this, by the way, and we won't go into all the details of that because it was a long-lasting dispute with his own mother, by the way.
Okay.
And, but he eventually came up into the world, and the first house he got was Burleith, and this is an example of Burleith, which is really quite a nice, one of the finer houses in Victoria.
The measure of the man is his
Yes,
estate, and this is where he went home to and put his feet up every night.
But he felt something else was more befitting of the Dunsmuir family, and he built a massive structure. And here it is. This is Hatley Castle, which I think is really almost unique in the West.
Now, where is that
Probably
in Victoria today?
Well, it's about 3.5 miles out of Victoria to the west.
Yeah.
And on about 1,000 acres, and surrounded by a stone wall, and it is really quite magnificent. He had 2 yachts, one called the Thistle, and here's a picture of a photograph of the Thistle, which I think is
It's a beautiful boat.
Is really, remarkable. Burned, by the way, the waterline in 1970.
I was going to tell our audience that they should listen for little strange things that happened.
Yeah.
It burned. Why did it burn?
Well, we were discussing that at lunch today. The reason it burned is the coal was faulty. Now, here was a guy who had access to some of the finest coal in the world, and he put cheap coal on the Thistle, and evidently combustion started the coal fire in the middle of the night, and they barely escaped with their lives. Barely escaped with their lives.
Well, he lost that boat, but he built another beautiful ship, and he named this after his favorite daughter.
Named it after Dola. He called it the Dolora. And this was about 218 feet long. The Kaiser went on board and was most impressed. And it was, but he tended to spend money like this. He had no thought for the future. He had no strategy, really. Whereas his other brother, and
this is Alexander.
This is Alexander. Now, here's a photo of Alexander in his prime. And Alexander had a very good business head. He was imaginative, great deal of charm. But he had one major flaw, which many of the Dunsmuirs did. He was a dedicated drinker. And eventually that dedicated drinking led to alcoholism really of the worst type. And he pursued a woman who'd been married several times. Actually, Josephine Wallace was her name. And Josephine Wallace had a daughter who eventually became a famous actress, Edna Wallace Hopper. But he pursued her for about several years before she became his mistress, and eventually married her, just actually about 40 days before he died. And he had promised her his estate in various stages of his alliance with her or dalliance with her, and he did not live up to it. He left his estate, despite promises to her and to his mother. He left his estate to his brother James. And his estate is estimated at anywhere from about $2 million at that time to $6 million. Despite his disarray when he was drinking, he made some very, very shrewd deals, real estate and other deals.
So, I mean, when he left it to his brother, did this result in some sort of fracas which consumed part of the assembled estate?
What happened was his mother knew that she had been promised by Alexander his estate, and so she sued James for the estate. His wife, which is Josephine Dunsmuir now, also joined in the suit. She died within about a year, or just about 18 months after his death. And so the stepdaughter picked it up, and it went through the courts, went all the way through the courts for about 5 years, Mike. Mm-hmm. They spent about $1 million in lawyers' fees and legal fees, and at the end of it, James won. So James won the case, and but he continued his profligate ways, and really quite astonishing.
So the $15 million that the family inherited, that the two sons inherited, and the wife, what was it worth by the time these two guys got finished with it?
Well, by the time they got finished with it, it was probably worth, I would think by 1906, about 1906, probably still worth about $10 million. But when James died in 1920, the estate had shrunk to $3 1/3 million. So here's from $15 million ratcheting all the way down to $3 1/3 million, and some of that was questionable.
Now, there are some more children involved in this, and this will be the third generation that inherits $3.3 million, and we'll talk about them right after this break. Ghost Town's Mike Roberts and Bill Barley, and we're talking today about the Dunsmuirs, the Dunsmuir family, and how they went from rags in the form of old Robert before he made it big to riches, $15 million, back to rags again before a couple of generations were gone. So we got past Robert and Joan's kids. They were Alexander, the profligate drinking man, and he died without any children.
Yeah, and James.
And James, and he had quite a number of children.
Yeah, he did.
So they were the big inheritors of $3.3 million, all that was left.
Basically, that's correct.
Okay.
And I think let's take a look at his eldest son. And this is Robert Dunsmuir, who went by the name of Robin. Now, Robin, and here's a photograph of Robin in his younger years, probably he's 18 or 19 years old, sitting on a table, entertaining his mother and her fashionable friends. And they're enjoying it, and he's obviously enjoying it.
Quite a rakish guy.
You bet, he's charming, he's good-looking, but he has some of those Dunsmuir flaws. And one of those flaws is he is, again, a very, very steady drinker. He's a gambler par excellence, but not with the skill of an ordinary gambler. And he is generally a little unstable. So he starts off fairly well. He marries quite well. A very, very fine woman he marries. And, but then he breaks, that marriage breaks up because of his constant womanizing. And he picks up with a dancer, and then picks up with another woman who's one of her major claims was entertaining at parties in somewhat an unladylike fashion, doing somersaults on the floor and so on. Although she was actually quite a nice woman, I think. And but eventually he drifts apart from her as well. But he still has some ability. He still has the Dunsmuir name. And he is offered a deal. He goes down to South America and picks up a deal with the government of Peru. And he is offered an ironclad deal, the deal of the century. He will be allowed to pick up all of the mineral rights in Peru, without exception, all of the oil rights, and the tobacco monopoly for a payment of $5 million. He hasn't got the $5 million.
So he needs some partners.
But he has friends. And the tobacco monopoly paid over $7 million in profits each year, so it's guaranteed.
He's guaranteed to make $2 million on the deal right away, and then the mineral and the oil will be on top of that.
Is free. Is virtually gratis.
It must have been not difficult to find some backers who said, I want a part of this gravy train.
He does everything right. He locks it up. He has it all documented. He has the signatures of all of the individuals who count, including the government of Peru. He goes to New York to raise the money. He has about half the money raised. He does a magnificent job of selling, and he didn't have to sell very hard because it's such a fine deal.
Sure.
They board a ship to take passage to England to get another couple of $1 million that they needed. Some friends of theirs decided to keep it in the family. It's such a good deal. They start to party it up a bit, and Robin gets carried away completely. He starts to run madly around the ship, screaming like a banshee. And they look at this for hour after hour, and they decide this guy cannot be president of the company. Finally, they quieten him down. They collar this guy and say, look, we're going to buy you out right now. We will give you $1 million cash. We have to have the documents and all the signed documents and all the plans and everything else. So he promises that. He goes back to his stateroom, opens the porthole, throws all the documents into the sea. End of a deal, which would have made him massive amounts, but it made his grandfather look like a piker, and he in turn drifts off to more gambling, more drinking, more womanizing. Finally dies at the age of 51 in a half-rate second-class hotel in Singapore.
And I would bet that all of those people who were aboard the boat with him went and signed their own deals with Peru right after that. And
yeah, it was a mark of the man. I mean, even as a young man, just after he was married, he went to San Francisco, Mike, He spent $9,000 in gold and checks in one night gambling in one of the gambling parlors or one of the areas in San Francisco. Now, $9,000 in those years, when the average person got around $300 if he were employed, is 30 years' work. He got rid of that in one night.
So we don't look to Robin Dunsmuir as enhancing the wealth of the Dunsmuir family. There was another son whose nickname was Boy, and
that was James Dunsmuir II.
This is the beginning of some eerie connections.
Yeah, it really is. And Boy was very serious. You see in all his photographs, he's extremely serious. Even here, and you get a photograph of Boy as a young man, and he's riding his horse, and he's a superb rider. He is an excellent horseman. But he is dour, he's fair-haired, he's good-looking. He was his father's favorite on the male side, not much doubt about it at all. And he decides when World War I breaks out, he joins the 2nd CMR, 2nd Canadian Mounted Rifles. And they are not overseas as quickly as he would like to go. He then arranges to join another regiment that is serving overseas and goes to New York and disregards the German notices in the paper. He goes on board the Lusitania. The Germans informed the passengers of the Lusitania and other ships flying under the British flag that they were fair game. And he gets on board the Lusitania. They go all the way across the Atlantic, get within 7 miles of the shore of Ireland, and a German U-boat spots them, picks them up, torpedoes them with a terrific loss of life. The Lusitania goes down with 1,000 people. One of these individuals is Boy. And I don't think his father ever got over it, and his mother didn't either. And it was a terrific blow to him. Okay. That was 1915, and his father died by about 60 months later.
Okay. A daughter, Effie.
Yeah, Effie is... Effie, I feel very, very sorry for Effie. Effie was, her other name really was Annie, but many of the, as you can tell, many of the Dunsmuirs had nicknames. And she married well. She had a dowry of about $200,000 plus a significant income of her own. And this is a photograph of Effie, and it shows the fragility, I think, of this young woman. And her husband was actually quite fond of her. But she had an unbalancing or unusual experience. She was with her husband in St. Petersburg, Russia, and there was a riot, a very, very severe riot, a bloody riot. And they were riding out of the area, evidently, in a carriage, and somebody threw a severed, bloody human hand through the window, and it landed on her lap. And it was simply so unsettling for her. She never got over it, they say. And there may be some truth in that. She was brought back to Victoria, and stayed there for a number of years, but really was in a state that they were compelled to put her in an asylum for the insane, and did that in England. And she spent the last, I think, about 44 years of her life in this asylum in England, and really went through her fortune rather rapidly. In fact, one of her relatives went in to visit her one time, and there where the private doctor was sitting there, and he was having champagne, and had quite a bit of it, I guess, and eating salmon. He said, yes, you know, Effie does love to give parties. And Effie died at about 89 years old, and just in time, because virtually all her money was gone.
Okay, that's Effie. Cat, oh, it was another one, Kathleen?
Kathleen, and nicknamed Cat, K-A-T. And she was also really quite good-looking, somewhat like Effie. And they were quite opposites in the family. And Cat had delusions of grandeur. She thought she was an actress, and this photograph of Cat shows Cat in the center of this troupe of young budding actresses in Victoria, and we're given 3 encores, and here she is in all her glory. And she marries, but doesn't marry well. The husband she married had absolutely no charm at all. They said not an ounce of charm. She eventually sheds him, and spends First World War actually in a canteen serving the soldiers, which she enjoyed immensely. But as the years go on, she gets herself into the Hollywood scene, spends $50,000 promoting a film as herself as the main star. It doesn't work out, of course, and was just saved when her mother dies in 1937 and leaves her a significant amount of money from the estate, which had gone down to about $1.25 million then, if I remember correctly. So it had gone down again. But she manages to survive on this. And in 1940, when the war breaks out, she goes back to England And she serves in the canteen again, her happiest times. One of her sons is getting married, and she goes to the Café de Paris. And she's celebrating with the son and the prospective daughter-in-law in the Café de Paris, and a stray bomb, without even any warning, comes straight down the air chute and blows the Café de Paris to smithereens and kills Kathleen. So, and the interesting thing about that was the Café de Paris had been actually fashioned or designed after one of the salons in the Lusitania, where her brother had died 25 years before.
This is when these eerie coincidences begin to make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And there is one other, Dola, after whom James named his yacht.
His yacht, the Dolora. And Dola was actually James' favorite daughter, but she was kind of a misfit to some extent. She married poorly. She felt out of place all the time. I felt sorry for Dola, but she met an actress, Tallulah Bankhead. And Tallulah Bankhead was a frenetic creature, always out of control, partying at all times of the day. In fact, a friend of Tallulah Bankhead said that a day away from Tallulah Bankhead is like a month in the countryside. And, you know, and she, in her own autobiography...
Cruel but fair,
in her own autobiography, she had good as admitted it. She said, you know, my candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. And that's what she did. She was a drinker. She took all sorts of drugs. And Dola, in essence, became almost her servant. And, you know, it's funny, you know, she followed Tallulah around the world and spent many, many years with her and became an alcoholic herself, unfortunately, and was working in a store in London, a high-fashion store, serving the Duchess of Kent at one time, and they delivered a telegram to her and said that the contents of Hatley Park were being auctioned off.
That beautiful house that their father James had built.
Magnificent house. And the house itself sold for $75,000, which was less than the cost of the wall that surrounded the property. $75,000. This is Hatley Park, or Hatley Castle. Yeah. And one suite for seated 20 in the living room, seated 20, carved oak, sold for $98. So essentially, they went up the top, came down the slide, and that was the story of the first three generations of the Dunsmuir family.
Rags to riches to rags, all in the space of, what are we talking about here, 60 years?
Well, we're talking about, Dola died in 1966. She was 63 years old, so we're talking just a little over a century.
$15 million to start with, and nothing to end with.
Yeah.
What an interesting story. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
The Dunsmuirs, the coal barons of Vancouver Island, with nothing to account for it after all that time. See you next time on Gold Trails.